we will have lost any opportunity to negotiate a better deal with the owners. And lo and behold, the Red Sox went out and lost in a game in which they played a very half-hearted effort, but lived to fight another day on the money front. It's been rumored over the last few years that there was some question as to whether maybe the Cubs had purposely thrown the 1918 World Series to gamblers a year ahead of the famous Black Sox scandal of 1919. And there's some circumstantial evidence that you could take either way about that. But one thing that seems very clear to me after doing this research is that it's pretty obvious that the Red Sox put no effort into winning Game 5. And maybe not purposely lost, but weren't upset that they lost, so they continued to fight about money with the owners. It didn't help. The owners wouldn't budge. And so they reluctantly decided they'd go ahead and play Game 6. They weren't getting anywhere. Public opinion was against them. They had no leverage. They just weren't going to get their money. And so they trudged into the ballpark for Game 6. The Red Sox actually took their championship photo before the game was even played. Both teams kind of went through the motions in what was an uneventful, undramatic, boring baseball game that the Red Sox won. And when it was over, they simply walked off the field. And the fans left the stands. No celebration, no joyous occasion. Now, part of that was that this was the fourth World Series the Red Sox had won in 6 years. They were the most dominant team of the age. So this was a little bit commonplace for them to win another World Series. But mostly it was just they were anxious to just get it over with, figure out what they were going to do about their draft status or their job in a factory somewhere. And baseball was going to shut down until the war was over, and they kind of were okay with that. They were kind of fed up. Little did anybody know that it would be 86 years before the Red Sox would win another World Series, and 95 years before they'd win one at Fenway Park.
And I wonder, what was the public reception to this? Because I remember in the 90s when there was a huge backlash against baseball for the season ending over the player dispute on salary. And you have something a little bit similar here, players that are not fully getting into the game over dispute on salary at a time when they're already stretching their likability and trust with the public by playing instead of serving in the middle of the war effort. Did you see a sense of a public reaction to this?
Yeah, and it wasn't good for players. Part of it was the idea that here these healthy young men are not having to put their lives at risk. And why does my son or my nephew or my brother have to get drafted and go serve overseas and maybe die? And these guys don't. So that was a very vehement part of the reaction. The other was the inability of the average person in America to identify with the kind of money these guys were making. Like, they were upset that they weren't going to make $2,000 and they were only going to make $1,000. There was another strike going on in Boston at exactly the same time. The motormen on the subway system were on strike, trying to get a raise to 35 cents an hour. So to them, this $1,000 that the winners were going to get, even though it was less than their expectations, was a fortune. It was a year's pay. And so they had no sympathy whatsoever for players or owners, by the way, because owners were clearly just rich guys that owned teams for their own amusement, not unlike today. And so all of society was pretty disgusted with baseball at the time and ready for it to sort of go away for the duration of the war. Nobody knew the duration of the war was 8 more weeks, but baseball was in a very precarious position at that point in time. Fortunately for the sport, 2 things kind of happened. One was that America, after the armistice, took on this amazing attitude of optimism. Everything looked great again. Everything was happy and upbeat. And this is what kind of led to the Roaring '20s. This renewed economic climate, a sense of optimism, of happiness that the war was over and America had come to the rescue and sort of saved the world for democracy. And the other thing that happened was Babe Ruth. Ironically, though, not for the Red Sox. After the 1919 season, he was famously sold to the Yankees and just captured the American attention. And in following his exploits every day as this outsized personality with immense talent, kind of ushered in this golden age of sports in the 20s. And so all was kind of forgotten and forgiven. And you're right, this kind of thing has happened to baseball over the years, and it always seemed that a particular personality came along and lifted the game onto his shoulders and brought it back to prominence. And the great example is 20 years ago or so, after baseball had gone through a work stoppage and actually canceled the World Series. Just on the heels of that, Cal Ripken made his run at the all-time record for most consecutive games played and captured America's attention and made everybody feel good about baseball again, and the ill feelings of the baseball strike were put behind them. And Ruth did that post-World War I for baseball and for the country.
And speaking about Babe Ruth in particular, you had mentioned that when you were thinking about this book, you saw pictures of him. He's not this overweight man that you see. He's not the Babe Ruth that starred in that embarrassing movie where he cures a kid's cancer from hitting a home run. What's that movie called? Yep. It's I'll have to look that up, but that's just a bad movie cliche for the ages. But this is a young, vibrant Babe Ruth. And was there anything that stuck out to you about him in this World Series?
Yes. And it was a theme that began earlier in the season. You know, he had been this fantastic pitcher. During this World Series, he breaks the record for most consecutive scoreless innings pitched by a pitcher. He had started it back in the 1916 World Series. It continued into 1918, and it was a record that stood for more than 40 years afterwards. And in fact, in his autobiography after his career, he said that he was prouder of his scoreless innings record than he was of any of his hitting records. So he was a fantastic pitcher. But he was clamoring to hit. He was a great hitter even on every fourth day, which is when he was playing. And because the Red Sox roster was depleted and having lost so many people to the war effort, they needed more and better players. And Harry Hooper, again, the Red Sox outfielder, badgered the manager and said, hey, why don't you let Ruth hit more often? Why don't you find a place to play him in the field? For two reasons. One, he's a great hitter. And two, do you really want Babe Ruth hanging around with nothing to do 3 out of every 4 days? He's going to get in trouble. So let him play. And the manager thought, well, I'll be a laughingstock. Pitchers don't play every day. If I change that, people are going to laugh at me. He finally gave in early May. He put Ruth in the game at first base, the first time he'd ever played anywhere but pitcher. And, of course, he hits a home run in that game and goes on a hitting tear over the next few weeks. By the end of June, at the time, the American League home run record for a season was 16. By the end of June, Ruth had 10 and was about to just obliterate this home run record. But again, the worker fight order, which was coming into effect on July 1st, meant that even more Red Sox players left and the team was even more shorthanded. And they clearly needed him more as a pitcher than they did as a hitter. So he got fewer and fewer days to play in the field. Excuse me. By the time the World Series rolled around, those old tensions resurfaced. Here they played 6 games against the Cubs. The Cubs used only 2 starting pitchers in those 6 games and just alternated days. And they were both left-handed pitchers. And so the manager of the Red Sox did not play Babe Ruth except on the days that he pitched. He wouldn't put him in the field. He wouldn't let him bat. And in fact, in a game in Chicago, with the Red Sox trailing 3-1 in the 9th inning on a day that Ruth did not pitch, this is game 2, They're trailing in the ninth inning. They've got 2 men on and 1 out, and you've got Ruth sitting on the bench, and the manager passed him over to pinch hit not once but twice. He just decided that on the big stage here where everybody can see, I'm not going to be the joker who lets my pitcher also be a hitter. It worked out okay for the Red Sox, but it could have cost them dearly.
This is another convergence point where you have baseball, the Great War is happening in the background, and we mentioned Spanish influenza. I'd like to take a look at something where 2 of these things converge together, and that's the 26th Yankee Division and their involvement in World War II. Could you describe that, unless there's anything else with the World Series you'd like to touch on before we shift focus?
No, I'm happy to shift focus. As we said, the United States didn't really have a standing federal army at the time that they declared war, but they did have these state militias. We'd call them National Guard units today. And the Massachusetts one was particularly well-trained and experienced and was one of the first American units in its entirety sent overseas in the very early part of 1918. And they served under French and British generals and saw a good deal of action. But by September of 1918, the American forces were gathered up into a single army under General Blackjack Pershing. There were enough troops in the field at that point that Pershing insisted that they be sort of reeled back in from their various deployments under other generals and said to the Allied commanders, we'll fight anywhere you want us to fight, but we will only fight as an American army in one place at one time. That didn't sit particularly well with the Allied commanders. And so in the middle of September, they sort of said to Pershing, oh, okay, here's your first assignment. I'm sorry. There's a particular piece of land in France that we have been fighting back and forth with the Germans about for 4 years. It's near a town named Saint-Mihiel, and it's what was called a salient. It's sort of a bubble, a little triangle that sticks out of the front lines. And we've captured it and lost it and captured it and lost it and have not been able to take it permanently. This is incredibly tough terrain where the Germans have really dug in with trenches and barbed wire barriers and things. And you want to fight as an American army? Fine. Go take that piece of land. Well, Pershing put together a war plan that was highly contingent on the 26th Infantry, known as the Yankee Division, because they were all from Massachusetts. And they took that piece of land in 12 hours that the French had been trying to take and hold for 4 years. It was a dramatic victory on September 12th, the day after the Red Sox won the World Series. And it was a key turning point in the war because certainly German troops and definitely the German high command realized after that big win by these Massachusetts men that there's a brand new army on the field. They're fresh. They're well equipped. There's over 1 million of them. And we don't think we stand a chance anymore. And it crushed the morale of the Germans' side. So much so that within 2 weeks, they were beginning to open talks about an armistice and a peace deal. And the real winning battles of World War I, the final climactic battles of the war, took place into October and early November at the Meuse-Argonne. But it was the Battle of Saint-Mihiel and the actions of this 26th Infantry Division that really turned the tide. One more of these remarkable connections between Boston and Massachusetts and events that were playing out on the world stage in this 30-day period.
Another figure, too, is David Putnam. He's one of the early aviation heroes in American history. So what did he do to get this reputation?
Well, we all grew up reading Peanuts cartoons and knowing that Snoopy was the World War I flying ace battling against the Red Baron. But an ace was a real thing. It was a title given to